It was July 1970, in the heart of summer, when the small town of Ozark, Alabama, was still living by the rhythms of a simpler time. The air hung heavy with humidity, and the long days stretched into warm, sticky evenings where neighbors sat on porches and children played until the streetlights came on. Life moved slow in Dale County. People knew each other. They trusted each other. They left their doors unlocked. On the night of July 25, 1970, 17-year-old Carolyn Trawick was supposed to come home. She'd been out with friends earlier that evening, enjoying the kind of freedom that came naturally to teenagers in a town where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. Her mother expected her back before midnight. But midnight came and went. The house stayed quiet. The front door never opened. By morning, Carolyn's mother was frantic. She called neighbors. She called friends. She called the police. And then, on July 26, 1970, the unthinkable happened. Carolyn's body was found in the woods just outside of town, near the Choctawhatchee River. She had been brutally murdered. Stabbed multiple times. Her life, so full of promise, had been stolen in the most violent way imaginable. The town of Ozark, Alabama, would never be the same. Before we continue with this shocking story, take a second to hit subscribe and turn on notifications. This channel brings you true crime stories that are often forgotten, cases where justice took years, sometimes decades, to arrive. These are the stories that deserve to be told. The victims who deserve to be remembered. And the families who never stopped fighting. Now, let's go back to 1970, to a town that was about to be torn apart by grief, fear, and a mystery that would haunt them for nearly 50 years. Have you ever lived in a town where everyone knows everyone? Where your neighbors are like family, and the idea of real danger feels impossibly far away? That's what Ozark, Alabama, was like in 1970. It was a close-knit community in the southeastern part of the state, nestled in Dale County, not far from the Florida border. The population was small, just a few thousand people, and most families had been there for generations. People worked at the local mills, the schools, the farms. They went to church on Sunday. They looked out for each other. Carolyn Trawick was one of their own. She was 17 years old, a senior at Carroll High School, and by all accounts, she was a bright, vibrant young woman with her whole life ahead of her. She was popular, kind, and well-liked by everyone who knew her. She had dreams of going to college, of leaving Ozark someday and seeing the world. But she loved her hometown too. She loved the people. She loved the familiarity of it all. On that July evening in 1970, Carolyn had gone out with friends. It was a Saturday night, and she'd told her mother she'd be home by midnight. Nothing unusual. Nothing that raised any red flags. But when midnight passed and Carolyn didn't come home, her mother's worry turned to panic. She called the police early the next morning, and a search began immediately. It didn't take long to find her. Carolyn's body was discovered in a wooded area near the Choctawhatchee River, just a short drive from town. She had been stabbed multiple times. The brutality of the attack was shocking, even to the seasoned officers who responded to the scene. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was personal. This was rage. The news spread through Ozark like wildfire. People were stunned. They were terrified. How could this happen here? Who could have done this? And more importantly, was the killer still among them? The investigation began immediately, led by local law enforcement and the Alabama State Police. In 1970, forensic science was still in its infancy compared to what we have today. DNA analysis didn't exist. There were no surveillance cameras, no cell phone records, no digital footprints to follow. Investigators had to rely on witness statements, physical evidence, and old-fashioned detective work. And at first, they had very little to go on. Carolyn's friends were interviewed. They told police that she'd been in good spirits that night. There were no arguments, no strange encounters, nothing that seemed out of the ordinary. She'd left the gathering alone, planning to drive herself home. Her car was found abandoned near where her body was discovered, the keys still in the ignition. There were no signs of a struggle inside the vehicle. No fingerprints that didn't belong to Carolyn. The murder weapon was never found. The area around the crime scene was searched extensively, but the knife or blade used to kill Carolyn was never recovered. There were no witnesses to the actual crime. No one had seen anything suspicious that night. No one had heard anything. In those early days, the investigation focused on people who knew Carolyn. In a town as small as Ozark, that meant almost everyone. Friends, acquaintances, boyfriends, classmates, they were all looked at, all questioned. But no one stood out. No one had a clear motive. No one had a solid alibi that could be disproven. Rumors began to swirl. In a small town, rumors are currency. People whispered on street corners, in church pews, in the checkout line at the grocery store. Maybe it was someone passing through town. Maybe it was a stranger. Maybe it was someone they all knew, someone hiding in plain sight. The weeks turned into months. The investigation continued, but leads dried up. Tips came in, but they led nowhere. The community held vigils for Carolyn. They prayed for justice. But as the calendar pages turned and 1970 became 1971, hope began to fade. Carolyn Trawick's murder became a cold case. For Carolyn's family, the years that followed were unbearable. Her mother, her father, her siblings, they were left with a grief that had no end, no closure, no answers. They attended church services where people offered condolences but never mentioned the murder directly, as if speaking it aloud would make it too real. They walked through the same grocery stores, the same streets, knowing that somewhere in that town, Carolyn's killer might be living a normal life. Going to work. Raising a family. Laughing at dinner tables. And there was nothing they could do about it. The case file sat on a shelf at the Ozark Police Department, gathering dust. Detectives retired. New officers came in who had never met Carolyn, who only knew her as a name in an old file. The town moved on, as towns do. Not because they didn't care, but because life doesn't stop for grief. Babies were born. People got married. Businesses opened and closed. The world kept turning. But Carolyn's family never moved on. They couldn't. How do you move on when the person who killed your daughter, your sister, is still out there? How do you sleep at night knowing that justice was never served? For nearly 50 years, Carolyn Trawick's murder remained unsolved. Her family aged. Her mother grew old, still waiting for answers that never came. Her siblings lived their lives under the shadow of a tragedy that defined them, that marked them as the family with the unsolved murder. The family that never got justice. And then, in 2019, everything changed. It's hard to overstate how much forensic science has evolved since 1970. Back then, investigators relied on fingerprints, witness statements, and physical evidence that could be seen with the naked eye. But by the early 2000s, DNA analysis had revolutionized criminal investigations. Cold cases that had been sitting unsolved for decades were suddenly being reopened. Evidence that had been collected years ago, stored in evidence rooms and forgotten, was now being tested with new technology. In Alabama, the state's cold case unit had been working through old files, looking for cases where DNA evidence might still exist. Carolyn Trawick's case was one of them. In the years since her murder, the original evidence had been carefully preserved. Clothing, biological samples, items collected from the crime scene, they were all still there, stored in the evidence room at the Ozark Police Department. No one had thrown them away. No one had lost them. They'd been waiting, all these years, for the right technology to come along. And in 2019, that technology finally arrived. Investigators submitted DNA evidence from Carolyn's case to a lab for testing. They were looking for any genetic material that didn't belong to Carolyn. Anything that might have been left behind by her killer. And what they found was astonishing. The DNA profile they extracted was entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database of DNA profiles from convicted offenders and unsolved crimes. And they got a hit. But here's the most shocking part. The DNA match wasn't to some drifter, some stranger passing through town in 1970. It wasn't to a known serial killer or a violent criminal with a long rap sheet. The DNA belonged to someone who had been in Ozark all along. Someone who had lived there for decades. Someone who had been part of the community. Someone no one ever suspected. The name that came back from the DNA database was Coley McCraney. He was in his 40s, a lifelong resident of Ozark. He'd grown up there. He'd gone to school there. He'd raised a family there. He worked as a truck driver, lived a quiet life, and by all outward appearances, he was just another member of the community. But in March 2019, police officers arrived at his home with an arrest warrant. They took him into custody without incident. And the charge was murder, first-degree murder in the death of Carolyn Trawick, a crime that had happened nearly 50 years earlier. The news hit Ozark like a bomb. People couldn't believe it. Coley McCraney? The man who'd lived among them for all these years? The man who'd been at the same grocery stores, the same gas stations, the same church services as Carolyn's family? It didn't make sense. It couldn't be true. But the DNA didn't lie. The arrest raised as many questions as it answered. How had Coley McCraney gone undetected for so long? Why had he never been a suspect in the original investigation? And what had happened on that night in July 1970? Investigators began piecing together the details, and what emerged was both chilling and heartbreaking. In 1970, Coley McCraney would have been in his late teens or early 20s. He was around the same age as Carolyn. He knew her. They weren't close friends, but in a town as small as Ozark, everyone knew everyone, at least by sight. They likely crossed paths at school events, at church, around town. The DNA evidence suggested that McCraney had been present at the crime scene. His genetic material had been found on Carolyn's body and on items at the scene. The evidence was strong enough to tie him directly to the murder. But what it couldn't tell investigators was why. What had motivated this crime? What had driven him to kill Carolyn Trawick in such a brutal way? Those answers, if they exist, remain locked inside Coley McCraney's mind. The legal process that followed was long and complex. McCraney was held without bond, and the case began making its way through the Alabama court system. His defense attorneys argued that the DNA evidence, while compelling, wasn't the whole story. They questioned the chain of custody for the evidence, asked how it had been stored for nearly 5 decades, and challenged the reliability of the testing methods. But the prosecution had a strong case. The DNA match was clear. The statistical probability that the DNA belonged to someone other than Coley McCraney was astronomically low. And the fact that he had lived in Ozark his entire life, that he had been there in 1970, that he had known Carolyn, all of it painted a damning picture. The trial was scheduled, and for the first time in nearly 50 years, Carolyn Trawick's family would have their day in court. They would finally get to see the man accused of killing their daughter, their sister, sit in front of a judge and jury and answer for what he'd done. But trials are never simple. And this one was no exception. As the case moved forward, more details began to emerge. Investigators dug deeper into Coley McCraney's past, looking for any clues that might explain why he had killed Carolyn. What they found was a man who had lived a relatively ordinary life. He had no prior convictions for violent crimes. He had never been arrested for murder before. On the surface, he seemed unremarkable. But people who commit terrible crimes are often good at hiding in plain sight. They go to work. They smile at neighbors. They live double lives, concealing the darkness inside them behind a mask of normalcy. And for nearly 50 years, that's exactly what Coley McCraney had done. The community of Ozark was divided. Some people couldn't believe that someone they'd known for so long could be capable of such violence. Others looked back at the past with new eyes, wondering if there had been signs they'd missed. Had McCraney always been dangerous? Had there been other victims, other crimes that had gone unnoticed? The police investigated those possibilities, but nothing concrete ever emerged. As far as they could tell, Carolyn Trawick's murder was an isolated incident. A horrific, brutal crime committed by a young man who had then gone on to live a normal life, carrying the secret of what he'd done for nearly 5 decades. Carolyn's family attended every court hearing. They sat in the gallery, watching as the man accused of murdering their loved one was brought in and out of the courtroom. It was the first time many of them had seen him up close. The first time they'd been able to look him in the eye. For Carolyn's mother, who was now in her 80s, the arrest was bittersweet. She had waited nearly 50 years for this moment. 50 years of grief, of unanswered questions, of sleepless nights wondering who had killed her daughter. And now she finally knew. But she was also exhausted. The weight of those 5 decades had taken its toll. She was an old woman now, and she knew that no matter what happened in court, no matter what verdict came down, Carolyn was still gone. Justice couldn't bring her back. But justice still mattered. The trial itself was a media sensation. News crews from across Alabama and beyond descended on Ozark, turning the small courthouse into a circus of cameras and reporters. For a town that had spent decades trying to forget the horror of 1970, the attention was overwhelming. But it was also necessary. The story of Carolyn Trawick's murder and the decades-long quest for justice resonated with people far beyond Ozark. It was a reminder that cold cases can be solved, that families never stop hoping, and that the truth, no matter how long it takes, will eventually come to light. The prosecution presented their case methodically. They walked the jury through the evidence, explained the DNA testing process, and showed how the science had evolved since 1970. They brought in expert witnesses who testified to the reliability of the DNA match. They showed photos of the crime scene, described the brutality of the attack, and painted a picture of a young woman whose life had been stolen from her. The defense did their best to cast doubt. They questioned the handling of the evidence. They suggested that contamination could have occurred over the years. They argued that DNA alone wasn't enough to convict someone of murder, that the prosecution needed to show motive, opportunity, and a clear timeline of events. But the DNA was damning. And the jury knew it. After weeks of testimony, closing arguments were delivered. The prosecution reminded the jury of the nearly 50 years that Carolyn's family had waited for justice. They reminded them of the young woman who had never gotten to live her life, who had never gotten to go to college, to fall in love, to have children of her own. They reminded them that the DNA evidence was clear, undeniable, and that Coley McCraney was responsible for her death. The defense made one final plea, asking the jury to consider the possibility of reasonable doubt, to think carefully about the weight of the evidence and whether it was truly enough to convict a man beyond all reasonable doubt. And then, the jury was sent to deliberate. For Carolyn's family, the waiting was agonizing. They had already waited nearly 50 years. Now they had to wait a little longer, as 12 strangers decided whether the man accused of killing their loved one would be held accountable. The jury deliberated for 2 days. And then, on a quiet afternoon in 2022, they returned to the courtroom with a verdict. Guilty. Coley McCraney was found guilty of the first-degree murder of Carolyn Trawick. The courtroom erupted. Carolyn's family members wept. Some cried out in relief. Others sat in stunned silence, as if they couldn't quite believe that this moment had finally arrived. After nearly 50 years, justice had been served. Coley McCraney showed no visible emotion as the verdict was read. He sat quietly, staring straight ahead, as the judge thanked the jury and scheduled the sentencing hearing. Outside the courthouse, Carolyn's family spoke to reporters. They thanked the investigators who had never given up on the case. They thanked the prosecutors who had fought so hard to bring McCraney to justice. And they thanked the people of Ozark, who had never forgotten Carolyn, who had kept her memory alive even when the case went cold. But they also spoke about the cost. The cost of waiting nearly 50 years for justice. The cost of living with the knowledge that their daughter's killer had been out there, free, all those years. The cost of the grief that had defined their lives. Justice had come. But it had come too late for Carolyn's mother, who had passed away just months before the verdict was delivered. She had waited her entire life to see her daughter's killer brought to justice, and she had died without ever seeing it happen. That was the cruelest part of all. At the sentencing hearing, the judge handed down a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Coley McCraney would spend the rest of his life in prison for the murder of Carolyn Trawick. He would never be free again. He would never have another quiet evening at home, another family dinner, another ordinary day. The life he had lived for nearly 50 years, the life he had built on top of a terrible secret, was over. Carolyn's family made victim impact statements. They spoke directly to McCraney, telling him about the pain he had caused, the lives he had destroyed, the decades of suffering his actions had inflicted. They spoke about Carolyn, about the person she had been, about the life she should have lived. And then they said goodbye. Not to Carolyn, they had said goodbye to her a long time ago. But to the case. To the decades of waiting. To the hope that had kept them going all these years. It was finally over. The resolution of Carolyn Trawick's case sent shockwaves through the world of cold case investigations. It became a shining example of how advances in forensic science, combined with determined investigators who refuse to give up, can bring justice even after decades of silence. Police departments across the country looked at their own cold case files with renewed interest. If Carolyn's case could be solved after nearly 50 years, what other cases might be waiting for their moment? For the people of Ozark, Alabama, the arrest and conviction of Coley McCraney brought a complicated mix of emotions. There was relief, certainly. The knowledge that the person who had killed Carolyn Trawick was finally behind bars. But there was also sadness, anger, and a deep sense of betrayal. He had been one of them. He had walked among them for decades, and they had never known. The case also raised difficult questions about the nature of evil. How does someone commit such a brutal crime and then go on to live a normal life? How do they carry that secret for so many years? How do they look at themselves in the mirror every morning, knowing what they've done? Those questions may never have satisfying answers. But what is clear is that Coley McCraney chose to live a lie. He chose to bury the truth, to hide behind the mask of normalcy, and to let Carolyn's family suffer in silence for nearly 50 years. And in the end, the truth caught up with him. It always does. In the months and years following the conviction, Carolyn Trawick's story continued to resonate. True crime documentaries were made about the case. Podcasts devoted episodes to it. News articles revisited the investigation and the breakthrough that had finally brought justice. And through it all, Carolyn's name was spoken again, remembered again, honored again. Because that's what this was really about. Not just catching a killer, but remembering the victim. Making sure that Carolyn Trawick was more than just a name in a cold case file. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. She was a young woman with hopes and dreams and a future that was stolen from her. And now, finally, the world knew her story. Carolyn's family created a scholarship fund in her name, offering financial assistance to students at Carroll High School who were pursuing higher education. It was their way of honoring the dreams Carolyn never got to fulfill, of making sure that her legacy lived on in a positive way. Every year, a young person receives that scholarship, and with it, a reminder that Carolyn Trawick mattered. That her life, though cut short, still has meaning. The scholarship is a small thing, in the grand scheme of things. But to the families of cold case victims, these small acts of remembrance are everything. They are proof that their loved ones haven't been forgotten. That the world still cares. That justice, even when it takes 50 years, is still worth fighting for. The case also had a profound impact on law enforcement. The Ozark Police Department and the Alabama Cold Case Unit received national recognition for their work on Carolyn's case. They became examples of what's possible when investigators refuse to give up, when they use every tool at their disposal, when they treat cold cases not as lost causes but as opportunities for justice. Other families of cold case victims reached out to the investigators, asking for help with their own cases. Some of those cases have since been solved. Others are still being worked on. But the message was clear: cold cases are not unsolvable. They just need time, resources, and people who care enough to keep fighting. And that's exactly what happened with Carolyn Trawick's case. The investigators cared. The prosecutors cared. The family never stopped caring. And in the end, that made all the difference. But here's something that often gets lost in these stories. Justice doesn't erase the pain. It doesn't bring back the person who was lost. It doesn't give the family back the 50 years they spent waiting, hoping, grieving. Carolyn's mother died without seeing her daughter's killer convicted. That's a wound that can never be healed, a loss that can never be recovered. Justice is important. It matters. But it's not a cure. It's not a magic solution that makes everything okay. It's simply the recognition that a wrong was committed, and that the person responsible must be held accountable. It's a line drawn in the sand, a statement that says, "This matters. You matter. We will not forget you." And for Carolyn Trawick's family, that meant everything. In the end, the story of Carolyn Trawick is a story about time. About the way it moves forward, relentless and uncaring, carrying us all along with it. About the way it can heal some wounds while deepening others. About the way it can hide the truth for decades, burying it under layers of silence and normalcy, only to have that truth rise to the surface when the right moment arrives. It's also a story about persistence. About the detectives who kept Carolyn's case file on their desks, who looked at it from time to time and wondered if there would ever be a break. About the family members who never stopped asking questions, who never accepted that their loved one's murder would go unsolved forever. About the prosecutors who took on a 50-year-old case and fought to bring it to trial, knowing that nothing they did would bring Carolyn back but doing it anyway, because it was the right thing to do. And it's a story about hope. The hope that justice, no matter how long it takes, will eventually prevail. The hope that the truth will always come to light. The hope that the people we've lost will be remembered, honored, and mourned, not as statistics or cold case numbers, but as human beings who mattered, who were loved, and who deserved better than the fate they were given. Coley McCraney is now serving his life sentence in an Alabama state prison. He has shown no remorse for his actions. He has offered no explanation for why he killed Carolyn Trawick on that night in July 1970. He has given her family no closure beyond the simple fact of his conviction. And perhaps that's the hardest part. Not just the waiting, not just the decades of silence, but the knowledge that even after justice has been served, some questions will never be answered. Some wounds will never fully heal. But Carolyn's family has learned to live with that. They've learned that justice isn't about getting every answer. It's about getting the most important one: who did this? And now they know. They finally know. And that, after 50 years of not knowing, is enough. The story of Carolyn Trawick's murder and the long road to justice has inspired countless others who are still waiting for answers in their own cold cases. It has shown them that it's possible. That even after decades, even when it seems like all hope is lost, justice can still be found. But it has also shown them that the road is long. That the wait is hard. That the pain doesn't go away just because an arrest is made or a verdict is delivered. Justice is not a destination. It's a process. And that process is often slow, frustrating, and heartbreaking. Yet it's still worth fighting for. Because every cold case represents a person who mattered. A life that was taken. A family that was shattered. And every time a case is solved, every time the truth is uncovered, it's a victory not just for that one family, but for all of us. It's a reminder that we live in a world where actions have consequences, where the truth matters, and where people who commit terrible crimes will eventually be held accountable. Even if it takes 50 years. Today, if you drive through Ozark, Alabama, you'll see a town that looks much like it did in 1970. The streets are quiet. The people are friendly. Life moves at a slower pace than it does in the big cities. But if you talk to the longtime residents, if you mention Carolyn Trawick's name, you'll see something in their eyes. A flicker of recognition. A shadow of old pain. Because Carolyn's story is part of Ozark's history now. It's woven into the fabric of the community. It's a reminder of a darker time, when the unthinkable happened in a place where people thought they were safe. But it's also a reminder that even in the darkest times, even when justice seems impossible, there are people who will never stop fighting for it. Carolyn's grave is in a small cemetery just outside of town. Her family visits regularly, bringing flowers, sitting quietly, remembering. The headstone bears her name, her dates of birth and death, and a simple inscription, "Forever in our hearts." For nearly 50 years, that grave was a place of unanswered questions and unresolved grief. But now, it's something different. It's a place of peace. A place where Carolyn can finally rest, knowing that the person who took her life has been brought to justice. It took too long. Far too long. But it happened. And that matters. As we close this chapter, it's important to remember that Carolyn Trawick's case is not unique. Across the United States, there are thousands of cold cases just like hers. Thousands of families still waiting for answers. Thousands of victims whose stories haven't been told, whose killers are still out there, still living their lives as if nothing ever happened. But cases like Carolyn's give us hope. They show us that cold cases can be solved. That advances in technology, combined with dedicated investigators and families who refuse to give up, can bring justice even after decades of silence. If you're watching this and you have information about a cold case, any cold case, please speak up. Call the police. Submit a tip. Don't assume that someone else will do it. Don't assume that the information you have isn't important. You might be the one person who can make a difference. You might be the one who finally brings justice to a family that has been waiting for years, or even decades, for answers. Because every case matters. Every victim matters. And every family deserves to know the truth. I want to take a moment to speak directly to the families of cold case victims who might be watching this. I know the wait is hard. I know the uncertainty is unbearable. I know that every day that passes without answers feels like another injustice piled on top of the original one. But don't give up hope. Don't stop asking questions. Don't stop putting pressure on law enforcement to keep working on your case. Because the investigators who solved Carolyn Trawick's case after nearly 50 years are proof that it's possible. That the truth can still come to light. That justice can still be served. It might take time. It might take longer than you ever imagined. But it can happen. And when it does, it will be because you never stopped believing. Because you never stopped fighting. Because you refused to let your loved one be forgotten. That's the legacy of families like Carolyn Trawick's. That's what makes these stories so powerful. Not just the fact that justice was eventually served, but the fact that someone cared enough to keep fighting for it, year after year, decade after decade, until the truth finally came to light. Carolyn Trawick was 17 years old when she was murdered. She never got to graduate from high school. She never got to go to college, fall in love, get married, have children. She never got to see the world, to chase her dreams, to live the life she deserved. But her story didn't end on that night in July 1970. It continued, carried forward by the people who loved her, by the investigators who refused to give up, by the community that never forgot her name. And now, more than 50 years later, her story has reached its conclusion. Not a happy ending, there's no such thing when a life has been taken so violently. But an ending nonetheless. One that brings a measure of peace, a sense of closure, and the knowledge that the person responsible for her death has been held accountable. Rest in peace, Carolyn Trawick. Your life mattered. Your story mattered. And the fight for justice in your name mattered. You will not be forgotten. Before we go, I want to thank you for watching. For taking the time to hear Carolyn's story. For caring about cold cases and the families who are still waiting for answers. This channel exists because of viewers like you, people who believe that every victim deserves to be remembered, that every story deserves to be told, and that justice, no matter how long it takes, is always worth fighting for. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of the importance of never giving up, then please consider subscribing. Consider sharing this video with others. Consider leaving a comment with your thoughts, or letting us know where you're watching from. These stories matter, and the more people who hear them, the more pressure there is to solve the cold cases that are still out there, waiting for their moment. And if you know something, anything, about a cold case, please speak up. Don't wait. Don't assume that what you know isn't important. Because you might be the one who finally brings justice to a family that has been waiting for far too long. If you believe in justice, if you believe in truth, if you believe in never giving up, then this channel is for you. We're here to tell the stories that others have forgotten. To honor the victims who never got to tell their own stories. To shine a light on the cases that have been sitting in the dark for far too long. Because every case deserves to be solved. Every victim deserves to be remembered. And every family deserves to know the truth. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And thank you for being part of this community of people who believe that justice, no matter how long it takes, is always worth fighting for. If you know something, say something. If you care about justice, keep watching. And if you believe that the truth matters, then please, help us keep telling these stories. Until next time, take care of yourselves. And remember, the truth is out there. We just have to keep looking for it. Subscribe so you don't miss the next.